There are voices that entertain, and then there are voices that confess. Ray Charles Robinson had one of those voices. The kind that did not just fill a room, it reached inside every person sitting in it and touched something they had spent years trying not to feel. Millions heard Georgia on My Mind and believed it was a love song, a beautiful, graceful tribute to a place and a memory, and it was. But it was also something else, something heavier. Something that carried the full weight of a man who had lost more by the age of 15 than most people lose in a lifetime, and had decided, somewhere in the ruins of all that loss, that music was the only language left worth speaking. This is the story of Ray Charles, not the legend, not the icon, not the Grammy winner or the Rock and Roll Hall of Famer. This is the story of the man underneath all of that, the boy from Greenville, Florida, who went blind in a world that had no patience for vulnerability, who buried his mother at 15 and walked into the rest of his life carrying that grief like a stone in his chest, who built an empire out of nothing but talent, stubbornness, and a refusal to be defined by what others said he could not do. But there is a night, one specific night, that this story has always been circling. A night when Ray Charles stopped a concert in the middle of a song, stepped away from the piano, and did something no one in the audience expected. Something that revealed, in a single unscripted moment, exactly who this man was beneath the sunglasses and the showmanship. To understand that night, you have to go back to the beginning. Part Own E. T. Boidlrntocent Darke Ray Charles Robinson was born on September 23, 1930 in Albany, Georgia. His family moved to Greenville, Florida when he was still an infant, and it was there in a small rural town where poverty was not a condition but simply the weather, that the first shape of his life was drawn. His mother, Aretha Robinson, was a woman of extraordinary strength, not the celebrated kind, not the kind that gets written about or remembered in speeches. The quiet, grinding, daily kind of strength that keeps a family fed when there is almost nothing left to feed them with. She worked as a sharecropper, took in laundry, did whatever was necessary. She raised Ray and his younger brother George largely on her own, and she did it with a fierce tenderness that Ray would spend the rest of his life trying to describe in music when words alone were not enough. When Ray was 4 years old, he watched his younger brother George drown in a washtub of water. He could not save him. He was too small, too frightened, too young to understand what death meant until it was already finished. That image, the stillness, the terrible helplessness, never fully left him. It settled somewhere deep and permanent, the way certain things do when they arrive before you have the tools to process them. Then, at the age of 4, Ray began losing his sight. The cause was glaucoma. In a different time, in a different place with different resources, it might have been treatable. In rural Florida in the mid-1930s, for a black child in a family that could barely afford food, it was simply a sentence. By the time he was 7 years old, Ray Charles was completely blind. What followed next is the part of this story that matters most, not the blindness itself, but what Aretha Robinson chose to do about it. She could have sheltered him. She could have wrapped him in careful protection, made his world smaller and safer. Instead, Aretha Robinson did something that bordered on ruthless in its love. She refused to let Ray be helpless. She taught him to do his own laundry, to cook, to navigate the world without the constant escort of a guiding hand. "You are blind, not stupid," she told him. "You have lost your sight, not your mind." Ray would repeat that sentence for the rest of his life. In interviews, in private conversations, in the way he carried himself on every stage he ever walked onto. His mother had given him the most essential thing a person can receive, the belief that limitation and defeat are not the same thing. At the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind in St. Augustine, Ray discovered the piano. Music was not recreation for Ray Charles. It was navigation. The way he understood the world when his other senses could not provide the map. He read music in Braille, composed arrangements entirely in his head, memorized orchestrations note by note. He developed a musical memory his teachers described as extraordinary, not just the ability to remember melody, but to feel the emotional architecture of a piece so completely that he could inhabit it rather than simply perform it. But the school years ended in tragedy. When Ray was 15 years old, his mother Aretha died. She was 31 years old. There are losses that break people, and there are losses that transform them. Sometimes both happen at once. Aretha Robinson's death was the single most devastating event of Ray Charles's life, a fact he stated openly without embarrassment throughout his career. She was not just his mother. She was the voice in his head that told him he was capable. She was the reason he believed in himself at all. He stood at her graveside, blind and 15 and completely alone in the world, and made a decision that would shape everything that came after. He would not collapse. He would not allow the grief to swallow him. He would survive, and the way he would survive was through music. But what happened next would change the entire direction of American music, and no one knew it yet. Par TTW. Longroad TOSSOWN. Ray Charles left Florida at 17 with $7 in his pocket and the name of a musician acquaintance in Seattle. He had chosen Seattle deliberately, the farthest point in the continental United States from Florida, a place where no one knew him, no one pitied him, no one had already decided what he could and could not do. In Seattle, he played small clubs and lounges, working the local circuit in a style heavily influenced by Nat King Cole and Charles Brown. He was good, remarkably good for his age, but he was performing music he admired rather than music he felt in his bones. The music industry of the late 1940s was a complex and often brutal landscape for a young black musician. The gatekeepers were largely white, distribution systems were segregated, and contracts offered to young black artists frequently ranged from exploitative to predatory. Ray Charles signed his first recording contract at 18 and would spend years navigating a business that valued his sound while minimizing his control over it. Control, artistic, personal, financial, was always the thing Ray Charles wanted most. A man who cannot direct his own life is not truly free, and Ray Charles was not willing to surrender the freedom he had fought so hard to construct. The breakthrough came slowly, then all at once. In 1952, Ray Charles signed with Atlantic Records, working with producer Jerry Wexler, who believed in recording artists playing their own music, in their own way. Something fundamental shifted. Wexler would later describe working with Ray Charles as one of the most rewarding experiences of his career, not because Ray was easy to work with, but because Ray was almost always right. What emerged from those Atlantic sessions was a sound that had never existed before. Ray Charles began blending gospel and rhythm and blues in ways that many in the black church community considered sacrilege. Gospel music was sacred, not meant to be mixed with the earthly world of nightclubs and desire. Ray Charles heard no such boundary. To him, the music was all the same river. The feeling identical, the reaching, the longing, the surrender to something larger than the self. The only difference was what you were reaching toward. Two-part EHRE, THE Ralza Broyalta ENRE. The song was called I Got a Woman, recorded in late 1954 and released in 1955. It was built on the framework of a gospel number Ray had heard on the radio, with lyrics rewritten to describe earthly devotion rather than divine love. The sound was raw, joyful, physically alive, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond technique, beyond training, from some deeper place where emotion lived before it had been civilized into performance. Radio stations played it, then played it again, then could not stop playing it. I Got a Woman reached #1 on the R&B charts and introduced a style, later called soul music, that would reshape American popular music for decades. Ray Charles had not just created a hit record, he had invented a genre. But this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because what the outside world experienced as triumphant breakthrough, Ray Charles was experiencing simultaneously as pressure, exhaustion, and a growing internal distance between the person he showed on stage and the person who existed when the lights went down. Success arrived fast and heavy. Ray Charles played hundreds of dates per year, traveled constantly, gave everything on every stage, and returned to hotel rooms that all looked the same in the dark. To be celebrated by thousands and then return to silence every night, year after year, creates a particular kind of interior weight that the applause cannot reach. He was using heroin during those years, a fact he would later acknowledge openly without shame. It would eventually become a crisis that forced a confrontation with himself that no audience could witness. But through all of it, the music kept coming. Hit the Road Jack, Unchain My Heart, Georgia on My Mind. One after another, songs that seemed less like composed pieces and more like emotional weather reports. Accurate, immediate, felt before they were understood. Ray Charles had a gift that very few musicians possess, the ability to make a listener feel that the song was written specifically for them, about their life, their loss, their love. The paradox was beautiful and devastating in equal measure. A man who could not see was making people feel more clearly seen than they had ever felt before. And then came a night that no one in the audience ever forgot. It was the winter of 1962. Ray Charles was at the height of his power. His crossover album Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music had shattered every expectation. A black artist recording country music in an era of rigid racial and genre boundaries, doing it brilliantly enough to become one of the year's best-selling records. He was performing in Atlanta, Georgia. The venue was full. Ray took his seat at the piano, adjusted himself in his familiar centering way, and launched into the set. About 40 minutes in, he began playing the opening chords of Georgia on My Mind. The audience responded with a collective exhale. That particular release the song always produced. People closed their eyes. Some swayed, a few sang along softly. Then Ray Charles stopped playing. Not gradually, not winding down, he simply stopped mid-phrase, his hands lifting from the keys in a single clean motion. The band kept going for 2, maybe 3 bars before the musicians registered what had happened. The music stumbled to silence. A confused murmur moved through the audience. Ray Charles sat at the piano without moving, His head tilted slightly toward the right side of the room, in the way he always turned when he was locating something with his hearing. And then he spoke. "Could someone help me understand?" he said, his voice quiet enough that the room had to silence itself completely to hear him. Why there are two separate sections in this audience? The room went very still. It was 1962 in Atlanta. The audience had been seated, as was standard practice throughout the American South, in racially segregated sections. White audience members in one area, black audience members in another. This was not considered unusual. It was simply how things were done. But something had reached Ray Charles through the sound of the room. A veteran performer develops a preternatural sensitivity to the acoustic character of a space. The way applause patterns reveal the spatial distribution of a crowd. The way a room's energy has a texture that an attentive ear can read. Ray Charles had spent more hours on more stages than almost anyone alive. He could feel the shape of an audience. And what he felt that night had stopped his hands cold. "I came here to play music," he said, his voice still carrying that same quiet, almost conversational precision. "Music does not have a section. Music does not care which door you walk through to get here. A part of happy and next." The venue manager appeared at the side of the stage. Ray Charles listened, responded briefly, and then stood up from the piano bench. He did not leave in anger. He simply communicated calmly and without performance that he would not continue the concert under those conditions. The show ended. Ray Charles walked off stage. What followed was professional turbulence. The promoter threatened legal action. Ray Charles was fined by his booking agency. The episode cost him money and created complications that would have been entirely avoidable had he simply kept playing. He did not regret it. Not then. Not ever. What he said in the years afterward, when asked about that night, was characteristically direct. "I could hear where everyone was sitting. You understand what I am saying? I could hear it. And what I heard did not sound like music to me." The image of that. A blind man hearing the shape of injustice when the sighted people around him had learned not to see it, lodged itself in the consciousness of everyone who heard the story. It was not symbolic. It was literal. Ray Charles had used the sense he had most completely developed to perceive something that most people in that room had stopped perceiving at all. But the story did not end there. This is important because what came after was not righteous isolation. What came after was music. To part sex the return, several months after the Atlanta incident, a genuine request arrived, not a command, not a demand. It came through intermediaries, carefully worded, asking whether Ray Charles would consider returning to Atlanta for a concert where the seating would be integrated. Ray Charles agreed. He returned. He sat at the piano in the same city, in a different room before an audience seated without division. He adjusted himself at the bench in his familiar way. He began to play. He played Georgia on My Mind. The song had been written by Hoagy Carmichael and Stuart Gorrell in 1930, originally recorded as a nostalgic meditation on the state itself. When Ray Charles recorded it in 1960, he had transformed it into something else entirely. His version carried a different weight. A man who had left Georgia, who had spent his childhood there in poverty and loss, who held complicated feelings about a place that had shaped him and also failed him in fundamental ways. That man's voice on a song called Georgia on My Mind was not simple nostalgia. It was something more tangled and more true than nostalgia allows. In that room, on that night of return, the audience understood something biography cannot fully capture. Ray Charles playing Georgia on My Mind was a man choosing to love something complicated, to remain in relationship with a place that had not always been kind to him, to refuse the clean simplicity of rejection. When the song ended, the audience was very quiet for a long moment before the applause began. Ray Charles sat at the piano and smiled, the wide, full smile that people who saw him perform always described as completely unguarded. Not a performance smile, not a professional one. The smile of a man who was in that moment, and then he kept playing Partiven Musasi Waselas Foar in 1965. Ray Charles checked himself into a rehabilitation facility to address his heroin addiction, voluntarily, deliberately at the height of his fame. He would later describe it as one of the hardest decisions of his life and simultaneously one of the simplest. He had reached the point where continuing as he was would mean losing himself, the essential self his mother had so carefully insisted upon. He emerged changed. The music continued and perhaps deepened. Something internal had shifted. A man in controlled forward motion had paused, looked at himself directly and chosen differently. This is what is most difficult to communicate about Ray Charles, not the genius which has been celebrated extensively. What is difficult is the quality of his self-knowledge. He knew exactly what he was. He knew where the music came from. He knew the price he had paid and the price he had imposed on people who loved him. He spoke about all of it without performance. It's the same quality that made his music devastating, made him as a person unusually direct about his own contradictions. In 1979, The Georgia state legislature named Georgia on My Mind the official state song and invited Ray Charles to perform it at the Capitol. He accepted. He sat at the piano in the Georgia Capitol building, the same man who had walked off a Georgia concert stage rather than perform before a segregated audience. He played the opening chords of a song about home. Legislators in the gallery were weeping. Ray Charles made no speech about what the moment meant. He did not need to. The MUDEHTTELACYHATDOTYVTCHEXP on 81 Ray Charles died on June 10, 2004, at the age of 73. His final album, Genius Loves Company, duets with artists shaped by his music, was released posthumously and won 8 Grammy Awards. But the numbers tell only the surface. They tell you Ray Charles was successful. They do not tell you what success cost him. He cost himself first years of addiction, the hard work of recovery, relationships strained under the weight of a life lived in perpetual motion. But what he gave to American music and to every person who has ever needed a song to say what they themselves could not, that is not measurable. He gave people the sense that someone understood them. That is what the music was always for. Not entertainment, though it was that. Not art, though it was profoundly that. The deepest function of what Ray Charles did was to make people feel less alone inside their own experience. To create, through voice and piano and an almost incomprehensible emotional intelligence, a space where the listener's private truth could be felt rather than suppressed. Georgia on My Mind, Hit the Road Jack, Unchain My Heart, I Got a Woman, You Don't Know Me. Each of these songs is a room that anyone can walk into and find themselves recognized. That is the result of a man who knew exactly what loneliness felt like, who had lived inside it from the age of 7, and who had decided to use all of that to reach through the darkness toward anyone who needed a hand. He could not see the faces of the people he moved. He could hear them. And hearing them, really hearing them, the way only Ray Charles could, was enough. People who saw him perform live would describe not a specific song or gesture, but the quality of his attention. The way he would tilt his head during a performance, not performing attentiveness, but actually listening, to the room, to the audience, to the music as it was happening rather than as it had been rehearsed. A man who had stopped a concert to hear the shape of an audience's injustice was the same man who spent every performance in a state of active listening. That is what genius looks like from the inside. Not the comfortable certainty of mastery, but the permanent, restless attention of someone who knows that the gap between feeling and expression is always wider than it appears, and who refuses to stop trying to close it. To EPILOGUE, Nuhati Darkness TGHTIM, his mother Aretha told him, when he was 7 and the world had gone dark for the last time, that he had lost his sight but not his mind. She was right, but she was describing only part of what he had left, what Ray Charles kept, what blindness, grief, poverty, discrimination, addiction, and fame could not take from him, was his hearing. Not just the physical sense, but the deeper kind. The capacity to hear what was really happening in a room, in a song, in a life. The capacity to hear what people were not saying and respond to that silence with music that said it for them. He was a man who learned to see in the dark by learning to hear everything. Every song was proof. Every time an audience sang Georgia back to him, those thousands of voices giving the song back multiplied, Ray Charles would tilt his head in that listening way, and you could see recognition cross his face. As if, after everything, the music had done exactly what he needed it to do. As if, after all the distance and all the darkness, it had finally brought him home.